Welcome back to Family Twist. I'm Corey.
I'm Kendall.
Earlier this year, we shared that we were going to not only retell Kendall's story for some newer listeners that might not know all the details, but kind of go deeper, take a deeper dive into his life as an adoptive infant, all the way through finding his birth family. So in episode 133, we talked about the adoption and what that process was like and how difficult it was for Betty and Ruble to finally have a child after years and years of trying and years of waiting to adopt. So today it's going to be, hopefully a little bit of happiness and sadness, but we're going to talk about the fact that when Kendall was, how old were you when Betty was?
Well, I was 6 when I didn't know it at the time, but she was diagnosed as terminally ill. And not that there were options that were going to be tried and were tried, but the outcome didn't look good. And my dad and she knew that at that point in time.
And this was a genetic illness.
It was, yeah. I was about to say she and all of her siblings. We really don't know why the oldest 2 who died first. My mother was 5th of 6, and her older siblings, her 2 oldest brother and sister, had already died before I was born. And nobody really talked about, I don't think there was much knowledge about what happened to them, but everybody suspects that they also had this enlarged heart, which the other 4 children were diagnosed with. So, yeah.
So how much were you shielded from the illness, even once they found out it was terminal?
Well, they never, ever told me that, which some people have said to me in my past, not on the podcast, but, I've been asked whether I was resentful about that. And I'm not, because how do you tell a 6-year-old, your mom's going to die? And especially if they had told me then, because she did live for 4 years. So that would have been, it was already difficult, right? To have a mother that was sick, because she was limited on what she could do and, how frequently she could be out and that sort of thing. So it was already tough enough. I think if I thought that she was going to die, I would have just been a mess for 4 years.
I feel like from what you've told me that Betty really tried to fit as much life into what she had left during those 4 years.
Absolutely. She had already started this program called the Homebound Ministry at our church. She started that before she became ill, but even when she was ill, what she wasn't able to do physically, she did on the telephone. Like, she still coordinated everybody's efforts. The theme behind that program was that there were many people who had been, senior citizens who were in our church who had eventually gone to live in assisted living or nursing homes. And back then, there were very few options for televised services. My church didn't do that. So my mother coordinated so that some of us from the church would go in and do a little service for them. It wasn't just people from our church. It was for everybody. But we also started, part of that homebound ministry was bringing the people who were able to be transported. We had a little bus that the church bought, and we would physically bring those people to church. These are people that were used to that and loved it and really didn't have family members who were doing that for them. So my mother got a lot of praise for this program. And in fact, it led to her getting a Jefferson Award, and which took us to Memphis, which is only an hour away. But for her, it was physically demanding to even go and accept that award. So she was able to transition a lot of what she had been doing physically into telephone work and really delegating responsibility. She was a great leader in many ways, and people loved working with her. So it wasn't too difficult to get people to volunteer with her.
In episode 133, we talk a little bit about the lake house and how fellowship was very important there. But I know that Betty and Ruble tried to fit in as much adventure and life for you as a kid, so you have those memories. What are some of the things that pop into your head as far as travels go?
My father was very fortunate because he worked for the Postal Service, and he had been working for them for, 20 years at this point that my mother was ill. And he had amassed lots and lots and lots of what they called annual leave, which is the equivalent of vacation. When I was 6, not long after my mother, I didn't know again, but mom and dad knew that my mom was not well and was never going to get much better, probably. My dad was able 2 different summers to take months off. The first summer when she was ill, so it would have been 77 when we would have been doing this travel. My dad took off 2 months from work in a row consecutively. We drove all over the place. We drove from Northeast Arkansas to California to see my dad's oldest sister, hang out with her and her husband. It was a great time. We stayed probably like 2 weeks with them. We went, we did the Disney thing, and we just did a lot of California stuff. We even went up to San Francisco from LA and really did some things with my aunt and uncle that I never got to do again. And this is my dad, his big sister, and he loved seeing her and didn't get to see her a lot because she lived all of her adult life in California. She was one of the smart ones who escaped our hometown as soon as she could. But anyway, so we spent a couple of weeks with them. My mother wanted to see, she had already seen it, but she wanted to see the Grand Canyon again. So we went and did that. Then she always wanted to go to Mexico City and had never gone. So we drove down to Mexico City. This is all in my mom's Monte Carlo. They got the workout. And then we got a wild hair while we were in Mexico. My dad contacted some friends of his that had moved to Guatemala, and we actually drove down there and stayed with them for a couple of days. I knew I was spoiled in that I always got to travel a lot more than other kids did, but I felt really fortunate that I was able to experience all those things with my parents. And it's funny because even though we were in the car and my mother wasn't doing the driving, it was pretty taxing on her to even do that, like to be in the car, and it was hot. It was the summer, and she was affected by the heat a lot because of her condition. So I admire her in retrospect a lot for, engaging at that level. I mean, yes, she wanted to do all those things, but she was also trying to make my father and me happy as well. So it meant a lot to me, especially when she passed away. I got to reflect on how much fun we had in getting all that time together. I even came home with a piñata, an authentic piñata from Mexico City that we used the following summer for my birthday party. It was part of the birthday party where the kids got to break the piñata and get all the candy and stuff. So, I feel like that adventure just continued.
And, I'm sure it was also taxing dealing with a 7-year-old sassy Kendall at the time too. I mean, that wouldn't wear anybody out.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think of Betty and you're traveling and stuff, like what images come to mind? Like, what did she like about traveling, or what activities did she like participating in when you guys were on the road?
Yeah. I mean, as much as she could tolerate it, she always wanted to get out wherever we quote stopped. We did kind of a surprising amount of walking when we were at the Grand Canyon. We did a surprising amount of walking in Utah and Arizona and Colorado during that trip, and New Mexico. And these are just all places that she loved. She absolutely loved the desert. Every chance we got, even though it was hot, she would allow us. Now, we did have a wheelchair for her too for that trip. She never really used one at home, but for that trip, we just knew she was not going to be able to walk everywhere that she would want to. So we did use the wheelchair a lot for her. And she was a proud woman. I know that was a concession that she knew that she had to make, because she was one of those people that wanted to seem strong and for her, I think that was admitting defeat, needing to use the wheelchair, which of course, in retrospect, I know is not, at all true, but, I don't judge her about that because she'd always been so independent and so able bodied before all this illness. And so it was just a sad realization for her that, this is what her life needed to be at that moment.
So you mentioned the birthday party with the piñata. What do you remember about those birthdays, 5, 6, 7? And did Betty make the cakes?
Yep. She always made my cakes, and my dad, quote, helped, but I know it was mainly that she was doing it. She enjoyed it, and she enjoyed decorating them. The summer that we got back from that trip all over the place, we had a pool party that summer for me. We had a pool at home, and we had a bunch of friends over, and she made me a pool-shaped birthday cake that was cute. It had a physical little prop that was the diving board over the cake, but then she drew the little people on the cake as if we were swimming. It was really cute. I wish I could find a photograph of that, but that was a lot of fun. They loved to entertain. They loved having all the kids and the kids' parents. And, it was an event. My mother did struggle. She did so much prep for the party that during the party, she actually needed to kind of go back inside and not be as active as she wanted to be. And my dad and I used to talk about the fact that she'd really worn herself out with that crazy long trip that we took, and was still trying to stuff in my birthday party before, which was, my birthday happened while we were in Mexico, but we had the party when we got back, and we were trying to squeeze it in right before school started. But I have really positive memories of that. The next year when we did the piñata party, we did it at the largest park in our hometown. And that was a lot of fun because I don't know what it looks like now, but back then it was a large park where there was a circular drive around the park, but the interior was all wooded and it was pretty. And they had things like old antique fire engine there, an old antique, I think it was a police car, fun things for kids to not get hurt on. But, that was part of the party too, was just getting to run around the park and have fun. And of course, that's where we did the piñata and had, my parents had hamburgers and hot dogs. It was like a big, big picnic for everybody. And it was a lot of fun. They were known for going overboard with these things.
Kids are pretty intuitive anyway. And obviously you're living with them and knowing that your mom has not always been well. At what age do you think you started to realize that she really was sick? And I know you'd mentioned before on the podcast that those last couple of years, she spent more time in the hospital than she did at home.
She did. I think people tried to guard me from the truth a lot. My parents purposely didn't tell a lot of people in the town that her situation was as dire as it was because they thought that the town was so small that I would hear about it, right? But even though they didn't, there was so much speculation about her condition that I would hear little comments, and it started to seep into my brain. I would politely and privately quiz my dad, but also try to be cognizant of his feelings. I'd say, hey, is mom doing worse than you say she is? It was difficult for me to ask. And of course, I think I made him sad by forcing him to even think about it. He was already a mess. He admitted after she died how those last few years were tough because he was trying to be strong for her. He was trying to be strong for me. He was trying to keep up the image for the public that she wasn't, as ill as she was. And again, not because he didn't think they would get support. They definitely would have, but very few people, their very closest friends and relatives were the people who knew how dire the situation was.
Yeah. And that's actually the theme for the next time we do one of these recordings. I want to talk about what life was like with him after Betty passed. And just based on everything that all the stuff you've shared with me over the years about them, like, I know that there's a lot of pain still with that, the relationship with you and Ruble. But I think as the days go by, I just become more empathetic to his situation, because this was such a partnership in every sense of the word that I can't even imagine. I can imagine me probably going through the same kind of motions that Ruble did.
And I didn't give him that grace as a teenager, and maybe most teenagers wouldn't. I'm not excusing myself. I just mean I've come to learn that some of my reactions were probably logical, but I do regret many of the times that I spoke to him disrespectfully after she died, and we can talk about that, like you said, on a different episode. But yeah, I've learned a lot of lessons since 1980, and re-examined my behavior during those almost 6.5 years before he died. I've re-examined my behavior and gone over it a lot in my mind. And, do we all have regrets? Of course. Do we wish we could rewind and reset and change? Yes. But at the same time, generally speaking, he and I had a good relationship. There were some tough moments. Probably every parent of a teenager would say that in general, but we had some moments.
Well, and I do think part of it is that Kendall falls into a lot of the stereotypical trappings of the the only child syndrome.
No, it's true. And I think that just happens kind of organically. They taught me to be respectful. They taught me, to not fall into those trappings, but I definitely did.
So interestingly, one of the stories that I didn't know before we started doing this podcast that I think just got brought up randomly when we were talking to a guest, and I certainly get why you wouldn't want to dredge this memory up. It's just devastating. But can you talk a little bit about, I think you know what I'm getting at, when you and Ruble came home?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, listeners, that I come from my hometown was about 3,000 people back then, and everybody knew everybody's business, or thought they did. And everybody knew that my mom was in the hospital in Memphis, which again was about an hour's drive for us. And my dad had a sister who lived in Memphis, so that was convenient because we would go down there and stay for days at a time, especially in the summer. And we'd stay at my auntie's house and, had easier access to the hospital, blah, blah, blah. So one of these times when we were gone, I think it was truly just for the weekend. I think we went down on like a Friday evening and we're planning to come back Sunday. So just, spent the whole weekend there. And we got home and my dad drove into the driveway, and we had an outdoor dog. Our next door neighbors would come and feed him in the morning and the afternoon, that sort of thing. And he obviously didn't need bathroom privilege just because he was in the fenced yard. But we came home, and midnight, the dog would always run to the fence when anybody came into the driveway, but especially if it were my dad. And he didn't come to the fence. And back then, there was a side door to the garage that was you could only open from you couldn't open it from the outside if it were locked from the inside, and it was standing open. And my dad was very concerned. We had left a light on in the house and that was not on. So my dad was very concerned, and he should have just driven straight to the police station, but he didn't. What he did was he backed his truck all the way back down the driveway so that we were parked really by the road. And as stupid as it sounds, he was like, I'm going to go check this out. So he made me lock the doors. I was inside the truck by myself, and he went into the house and found it ransacked. I mean, it was obviously a robbery, but it was funny because yes, they took some things that were valuable, but it was also either they spent a lot of time there or they purposely or they just purposely wanted to be mean, because they did things like my mother had some art that was worth something and that was, in frames, and they didn't take it. They sliced it with a knife. You know what I mean? So they were ruining things to ruin things. It was just sad. And because I also was very curious, I didn't stay in the truck like my dad told me to. I walked up to the house, and my dad definitely didn't want me to see what he was seeing, but I did. And I still have, this happened in 1977. But it was devastating to see our house, ransacked like that. I mean, they stole my TV from my room. I mean, who cares? But for a kid, I felt very, very violated. And then, of course, I already was concerned about the dog because, like I said, he always was, he'd always come to the fence. And anyway, so my dad said, I told you not to come to the house, go back to the truck. So I did. And I could tell what my dad was doing. He was trying to find the dog, and he was also very concerned. And he was moving quickly around the yard looking for the dog. And he did find our dog dead, and not an old dog. He was 4 years old at the time. I got him when he was a puppy when I was 3. And so, we found out that there was poisoned meat lying near him. And so we know that the people that broke into the house, well, again, everybody knew I had a dog. So that wouldn't have been surprising, but it felt very planned, as if the people showed up, knew that they needed to get rid of the dog. Although they really didn't if he were locked in the backyard. But I suspect if I know my dog, he'd be barking his head off, even if, he couldn't get to them. So I think that's what it was. But so tragic in many ways. We didn't even tell my mother that this happened because we knew how upsetting that would be to her. So my dad just did everything he could do to get things, back in place and things repurchased that had gone, not that she wouldn't notice, but that when she got out of the hospital and came home, it wouldn't be as startling as, it would have been had she been with us when we made the discovery.
Sure. I mean, it's just sick. People who do stuff like that. It's just disgusting.
And we never really got closure. My dad scoured every pawn shop for things that were family heirlooms. One guy who was owned a pawn shop about 20 miles from our hometown said that he came out with the cabinet that my mother's heirloom silverware had been in. Now, we knew that was, so the silverware is gone and it's probably got melted, but we actually got the case back. But that was just, again, it was just mean. My mother's parents didn't have a lot, and that was something that they had. It was one of the few things that she really had to remember them. And that's a first, world problem. I get it, but it was still devastating to everybody involved.
And, for a little kid to be able to find solace in their dog when knowing that their mom is in the hospital is so important. And it's just like that somebody would take that away from you. Yeah. We know how therapeutic our dogs are. And, maybe that's why we have so many.
Yeah. Well, a nice thing about that is right after that happened, the auntie that I was talking about in Memphis, her son was breeding Doberman Pinschers. And I got one of those as a puppy. And so, my dad was trying everything he could do to normalize all the crazy things that had happened. But yeah, and it's just, I talk about it now a lot easier than I did even when you and I met back then. It used to really tear me up still. I mean, it still makes me sad. To your point, that was my dog. I loved him. He was my buddy. We played together all the time. My parents got him for me when I was 3, so devastating. I think I cried as much about that as I did about anything. You know what I mean? Like, nobody wants your house to be burglarized, but I was much more affected by the death of the dog. And my dad also didn't want me to even know about that, but I was just kind of there for it all. And he was in shock. He just couldn't believe any of this was happening. And I think otherwise he would have guarded me more. We went and stayed that night with my mom's sister who lived in the same town. We couldn't even be there. You know what I mean? Like we couldn't, well, the house wasn't secure anyway. They had broken, the door to the point where, you know what I mean? Like nobody would have stayed there, but it was just traumatic. And you're right. For somebody in that town to know that we were gone and then take advantage of that situation in the way that they did, that's just a special kind of shitty. That's just crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I said, we're going to talk more about your relationship with Ruble the next time we do one of these Kendall-centric episodes. But I do want to put it out there to our listeners that if there are questions that I haven't asked Kendall about his adoptive parents, please send them to us, either an email or a voice message or however you want to do it. But we'd love to help answer any questions that you might have. And so we're not completely ending on a sad note. We want to say that it's very therapeutic for us and gives us a reason to keep doing this when we get emails like we did this week. Really long email, someone who found the podcast a couple of weeks ago and very appreciative for what we're doing and, told the story of his adoption and birth family. And hopefully he's going to be a guest on the show. He's agreed to. We just have to schedule some time. But it's so heartwarming to hear from people. And this is not an isolated incident. We get one of these emails a couple of times a week. And it's just because it's emotionally taxing for Kendall, not only dredge up his past, but he gets triggered from the stories that we have from our guests. And so it's a very emotionally taxing time, even though we're only doing it for half an hour or an hour. It's like he's pretty emotionally drained after doing one of these. But I think when we get this kind of feedback that like recharges his energy,
It absolutely does. And the more I get to tell my story, I feel like it lessens the heartache. You know what I'm saying? I get what you're saying, Corey, that it is emotionally taxing and it is, but it's my reality. And, some people don't go through those kinds of things and some people go through much worse. So I try to think about it like that, that everybody deals with so much and it's what we do with those experiences that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. So as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for all your feedback and we appreciate you. And remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.